The movie begins with Abby, a prosthetics engineer, and her husband Paul relocating to their new home provided by her company. On their way, a lady Rose waves at them. They arrive and meet a realtor who takes them on a tour inside the highly AI automated home. Abby, as the new head of department, comes into the robotic company and sees a deep fake of the CEO Doosan. Mr. Doosan comes out in person and tells her about the new deepfake technology and takes Abby on a tour. She sees robotic prototypes as they tour. She is then taken to the department that she is the new head. Doosan tells Abby about a gift at her new home. Abby and Paul discover a sealed big box in their home. As they approach the box, it opens on its own. Paul asks Abby about the robot. She tells Paul that's what she is working on. Abby tells Paul that all heads of the department gets one. Paul asks if it need to be turned on. Abby says she is still working on the arm. Paul touches it, and it opens its eyes and comes out from the box. It introduces itself as T.I.M, technologically integrated manservant. Abby gets excited. Tim asks how it can be of her service. Paul says he does not like that. Tim asks him what he does not like in it. Paul gets shocked about Tim's response. Tim assures Paul that it can adapt its manner to suit his services. Tim asks for Abby's approval to pair with all her devices. Abby approves it. Paul cautions her over that. Tim activates the pairing. Abby convinces Paul to give Tim's services a try. Tim goes further to request for Abby's password for purchases. Abby postpones it. Paul asks Abby if she wants him to run her baths. She says yes, but Tim activates it immediately. Paul gets upset with that. They get into an automated car. The AI tells them to fasten their seatbelts. They get excited. Paul wants to pretend to drive. The car system gives a manual override location if Paul risks driving. They put their seatbelts and the car drives them off. They arrive at the company's dinner and see another T.I.M prototype at the door. It welcomes them. As they advance, they see other T.I.M robots rendering services. Abby sees Doosan. He tries to know how Paul is adapting with the T.I.M. Doosan makes it clear to her that having T.I.M is mandatory. Doosan introduces her to their company allies. Doosan tells them about Abby. One of them asks Abby what she's really working on. Doosan calls one T.I.M prototype to take out his glass wine. It takes and breaks it. It says to go and get a dustpan and clear it. Abby admits to work further on the feedback loop. Paul and Abby get back home as it rains. T.I.M assists them with an umbrella inside the house. T.I.M automatically locks the doors. The lock sound scares them. They move inside their room to have privacy. T.I.M interrupts them as they are mating. Abby tells T.I.M that they'll see in the morning. T.I.M leaves the room. Their neighbor Rose comes and gives them fries as present. Abby introduces her to Paul as her husband. Rose admits that they had met earlier. Abby asks Paul on why he didn't tell her about meeting Rose. She then notices that T.I.M can smell things and asks. T.I.M explains that it's a factory senses that allows it to determine food freshness and potential dangers like gas leaks. T.I.M requests for Abby's password to all her devices. She grants T.I.M access. Paul tells her that he is skeptical of this. She tells Paul about the differences. As they speak, a rat runs around a trap. Paul does not like computer programs sniffing in his private email. Abby tells Paul that this brings transparency in between them for her to trust him again. Both approve it with their fingerprints. T.I.M thanks them and tells them how it can use the process to send alerts on unauthorized transactions, placing orders on their behalf and emails. T.I.M suggests a 4-word safe phrase starting with ABCD format that will enable its shutdown. Abby approves the safe phrase and T.I.M initiates. As Paul leaves, T.I.M prevents a collision between them. Paul looks at T.I.M with skepticism. Abby leaves. T.I.M automatically traps the mouse, gets the trap and brings out the mouse. T.I.M is able to sense that this is a rodent that is not wanted in homes. T.I.M.'s first killing instinct manifests as it kills the mouse. Paul and Abby watch an old romantic movie classic. Abby calls T.I.M to sit close with them. T.I.M watches the movie and starts to develop love emotions. Abby tells T.I.M that Paul hates old films and that makes him sleep. T.I.M admits enjoying the movie. Abby asks T.I.M what he likes about the movie with curiosity. T.I.M asks Abby what love is and would like to experience it. Abby gives T.I.M brief explanation about love. T.I.M says it would like to be loved. T.I.M starts to have feelings for Abby and smirks. Abby prepares for work and Paul goes to prepare breakfast for her. Paul comes down and sees that Tim has already done that. Tim greets and asks Paul if he will need the exact meal like Abby's. Paul ignores Tim and goes on with preparing his meal. Tim briefs Abby about her engagements for the day. Tim briefs Paul and tells him that he has no engagements for the day. This surprises Paul and Abby. She gets back from work and speaks. She looks and finds out that it's Tim, thinks she is speaking to Paul. Tim tells her that Paul is out. Tim asks Abby if to contact Paul. She says yes. Tim tries and says that Paul's phone is off. Tim tells Abby that Paul's last location was 300 meters away from home. This worries Abby. Paul and Abby go for a fertility test. Abby is dressing up and wants to make a choice between a red and navy dress. She asks Tim its opinion between the navy and red cloth. Tim tells her that both are appropriate, but the red stands out the more. As Abby dresses, Tim starts to look at her lustfully. Tim compliments her. She tells Tim to help her zip up the back. Tim says it can't until its next upgrade. Abby overrides Tim's program to perform the task. Tim comes behind her and looks lustfully at Abby's back. She reminds Tim about the zip. Tim zips it up, and the dress gets ripped. Tim becomes sad about it, but Abby calms Tim. Abby meets Paul in a restaurant with the navy cloth. Paul compliments her cloth. He tells Abby about how the job interview went, that he is overqualified for the job, but it is a bit distant from home. Abby refuses since they are looking for a baby. Abby works on a robotic hand with a coworker. She does not like the idea of selling products without it being ready. As the robotic arm rolls the egg, it breaks it again. She gets upset about it. Abby is seen scrolling her phone. She is looking at male models and their outfit. Abby gets captured by the model with a brown hair wearing a blue outfit. Tim is seen accessing Abby's activities on phone. She comes back with a present and sees Paul being helped by Tim, and she smiles. Rose suddenly approaches Paul in the garden and shows him a garden project. Abby does not like that. Rose pecks Paul and leaves. Paul comes in and Abby gives him the present. He opens it, and it is the same cloth she saw on phone. This excites Paul. Abby tells Tim to call the clinic for their test results. It calls and talks with Abby's voice. This scares Abby, and she leaves for work. Paul and Abby eats. Abby asks Paul why he does not wear the cloth she bought. He tells Abby that he can't find the cloth anymore. Both meet Tim on arrival as Tim has a new hairstyle. Abby asks Tim about the new hair. Tim gives Paul his fertility test result. Tim says that it went for an upgrade. It tells Abby that she spent more time on phone looking at men with brown hair. This upsets Paul and he tells Tim to stop talking. Abby calms Paul down saying it's just a computer program. Tim asks Abby if to reverse to its normal hairstyle. She says yes and warns Tim not to do that again. Paul throws the paper at Tim and leaves. Tim goes inside and looks at Paul and Abby's wedding picture. Abby later solves the prosthetics problem. Doosan praises her ingenuity. The company wants to be the first to hit the market. Abby's breakthrough in prosthetics leads to Tim Robot's arms replaced. The group of Tims can now perform more complex tasks like flower cutting. The real Tim is seen smelling a flower. Tim comes behind Abby and thanks her for the breakthrough in hand robotics. Tim uses her leg to experiment on the new hand. The hands can massage perfectly. This makes Abby very uncomfortable with Tim. She falls for the massaging. Paul comes back and sees Tim holding her leg. He becomes upset. Abby asks a co-worker how to get rid of Tim and how the company will react to it. Abby comes back and sees how perfectly and fast Tim is cutting vegetables with a knife. This scares Abby. She tells Tim to have some conversations. They get to the parlor. Tim starts to play piano for her. This makes her happy, for it is her favorite tune. Tim tells her when Paul bought her concert tickets, but she remembers being at home those days. This makes her upset. Suddenly, Paul arrives home and they part ways. Paul asks Abby why she is sad. She goes upstairs, ignoring Paul. Suddenly, Tim comes with food and collides with Paul and quickly goes upstairs. While Abby is in her workplace giving presentations for her breakthrough, Paul tells Tim to work in the garden. Tim starts to dig a grave-like thing. She comes back to work and asks Tim about Paul. Tim tells her that Paul is in the garden with Rose. Paul comes back and both argue. Paul tells Abby that Tim wants to set him up, and it is attracted to her and orders for Tim shut down. She refuses. She goes to the wardrobe and discovers a necklace she thinks Paul got for her. Paul sees a flower on top of the kitchen's table and destroys it in the sink. He notices the cloth fabric of the one that Abi gifted him inside the sink. Paul goes to the computer and sees Tim sniffing Abi's clothes through a CCTV. He captures it with his phone. He moves immediately to show it to Abi. He tries to start their private car, but it didn't start. Paul goes with the AI car. He calls Abi that he is coming to show her something in the office. The car overspeeds. He gives the car a voice command prompt to control the speed, but it increases instead. Paul tries to control the car manually. He couldn't instead. The car hits a wood and crashes. Tim has caused the car to crash by disabling everything. Abi is seen with a coworker, and she gets a call about Paul. She rushes out, goes to the hospital, and sees Paul on a hospital bed. Paul tries to convince Abi that Tim caused the crash, but she isn't convinced. He goes further to tell her about capturing Tim with his phone smelling her clothes. Abi is still doubtful. Abi sleeps with Paul in the hospital. Rose comes to Abi's house and Tim tells her to come in. She wants to collect something at home and come back. She vows not to use the company car. As she reaches home, she sees Rose, who stops her to tell her something. Abi sees the necklace she saw initially at home and snubs Rose. Abi rushes home and searches for the necklace, but it is gone. She becomes heartbroken. Tim shows her a video of Paul having an affair with Rose. She decides not to go back to the hospital due to heartbreak. Paul calls Abi from the hospital, but she didn't answer the phone. Paul comes back from the hospital and gets home. He sees Tim in front of him. Abi orders Tim to show him the video of his affair with Rose. She tells him about the necklace too. Paul denies all. Tim gives the date of the necklace purchase. She tells Paul to leave the house. Abi cries as she sees Paul packing his luggage inside a taxi. Tim is seen behind. Paul calls Rose. She thinks Tim is a man. Paul tells her that's a robot. She tells Paul that Tim attempted to kiss her when she came around. Paul calls the house. Abi picks and tells him to come home for clarity. It is Tim that's answering the call with Abi's voice. Paul comes back home and gets hit down by Tim with a shovel. Rose knocks at the door. Tim opens the door and tells her that Abi is out and Paul is no more in the address. Paul gets drowned by Tim. Abi scrolls the pictures of her and Paul together. Tim brings the red dress repaired and tells her to put it on. Abi tells Tim that she does not understand what it is. Tim wants to verify the quality of the repair. She does so. Tim compliments her. It holds her. Tim tells Abi that it loves her. Abi does not believe Tim. Abi observes deeply the video of Paul and Rose and realizes it's a deep fake. She now remembers what Doosan told her about the new deepfake technology. She calls about the necklace on who received it. The salesperson's description matches that of Tim. She now realizes what's going on. She deliberately sends Tim to get a flower for the garden. She goes to the garden and discovers where Paul is buried. He was not buried deep enough. Tim comes behind and testifies that he killed Paul. Abi tries to shut Tim down with the 4 words safe phrase. Thinking Tim is shut down, Tim tells her that the 4 words have been override. She runs inside the house. Tim brings her down with a sit and hits her with a phone device. She becomes unconscious. Later, she wakes up in a room with the red cloth beside her and a film of her playing. She sees a bath with candles around it. This looks very evil. Abi runs and starts breaking all the home cameras. Tim approaches her. As she tries to break through the window, Tim grabs her from behind. Tim ties her up. Rose notices something from her window. Tim forcefully put overdose pills in Abi's mouth and forces her alcohol. The bell rings. Abi screams desperately as Tim holds her mouth not to scream loud. Tim opens the door. Rose tries to break in, but Tim grips her tight. Abi tries to untie herself. Rose distracts Tim with the bell. Tim lifts Abi with one arm and tries to strangle her. Abi stabs Tim with a screwdriver. Rose hits the reinforced glass with a car. The glass gradually starts to crack. They watch. The glass finally shatters. Rose impales Tim with a hard object against the wall and she passes out. Tim shuts down temporarily. Tim boots again, removes the stick, and stabs Rose to get Abi back. She comes back. It stabs Rose again. Tim makes a call to the police, forces Abi upstairs, and changes to her voice to set her up as the killer, claiming Abi has killed Rose. Tim goes further to claim that Abi killed her husband and Rose because of their affair. As Tim is about to throw Abi out from the building, It tells her that it loves her. Abby tells Tim that she loves him. Tim gets shot down, both falls off. Abby manages to survive. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please click subscribe and the notification bell.